Welcome back, everybody, to another web tips tutorial. My name's Chris, and I will be walking you guys through this one. If you didn't watch our first HTML 1-1 tutorial, um, just to do a basic recap for you, excuse me, we spoke about essentially our basic file structure in our HTML documents. We talked about the hypertext markup language, what HTML actually stands for. We covered a few basic tags, including the HTML, the head tag, what goes inside of that, the metadata that goes inside of the head tag. We covered our body and some basic tags, including the heading and the paragraph. If you guys did not watch the previous tutorial, I would absolutely recommend going back and watching it if you're not familiar with what you're seeing on the screen now before you continue on. Also, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more web tips tutorials. We bring one every week. And we're going to be moving forward in this tutorial with some more advanced concepts regarding HTML, including divs. We're going to talk a little bit more about, nesting, and we're going to get into just a tiny touch of CSS with some talk regarding attributes. What is an attribute and how we really can understand the scope, that's a new term, of our HTML tags and our HTML elements. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. Alrighty, so just to pop on over here, something that we did cover when we talked about the break tab or break tag. I do that a lot, don't I? The break tag. We talked briefly about that. Let's change the color here. I don't know if you guys can see that too well. All right, so the break tag, in that it's a self-closing tag, okay? And all a self-closing tag is a tag that closes itself. So it doesn't need an open tag and a close tag. It just needs one tag for itself. So the best way to really explain that is to show you. And we briefly talked, like I said, about the break tag. So let's go ahead and throw that in here. That is a self-closing tag, guys. Take a look at that for a second. What difference is there between this and the H1 tag? Well, it's pretty simple. The break tag here that we're looking at basically is a closing tag essentially, but it works by itself. So if we want to throw this break tag in here, we'll notice that we get an extra indentation within that's rendered within the actual browser itself. So what we see over here, the space in between these two paragraphs, we'll see that change. And let's go ahead and show you again. So another break, we get another gap between our fonts. Okay, so we talked about that last time. So let's go ahead and get rid of those. Another self-closing tag that I wanted to briefly touch on that is very important. We also touched on this last time, is the link tag. Okay. Now this is a self-closing tag in itself, but you'll notice it actually has a few attributes inside of it. Well, Chris, what the hey is an attribute? An attribute is essentially data within our tag that helps us to either define what it's associated with, another file that it's associated with, or if it were a class, we would basically be giving a name to it. And that would essentially allow us to, when we get a little bit more into CSS, that would allow us to specifically, more specifically, rather than just using the element name itself, target a specific element based on that attribute. So that might seem a little bit confusing, guys. So let's go back over here. Don't get too much hung up on that. Excuse me. There's only a few self-closing tags that really you're going to use. These are kind of the main two, the link and the line break. And just to break down the link a little bit more, all the link is doing is it's specifying the relationship to what it's linking to. So in this case, we have a link with a relationship of style sheet. And all that's saying is that the reference, the file that we're referencing, or the href, that file is going to be a style sheet. Okay, so we're just basically saying, all right, well, let's go ahead and link a style sheet, and the location of the style sheet is going to go within that href. So if, once again, we're working in a sandbox environment, guys, that's what Codepen is. So inside of this sandbox environment, we don't really have to link our CSS file because it's already being linked in the background through this Codepen sandbox environment. But if we were in another code editor that was not online, it was not a sandbox environment where the files were already being linked, we would have to specifically give that file location. So typically it's going to look like this: href main.css. Okay, and that would basically be saying if we named our file main.css, we are just simply linking that file by its name, which would be main.css, which is a style sheet. For those of you guys that aren't familiar with CSS and what it stands for, CSS stands for Cascade Style Sheets. You can pretty much disregard this SCSS right here for now. I prefer to write in what's called the SCSS syntax, and that is basically a pre-processed language. So for those of you guys that don't know what that means, a pre-processed language is just another way of writing one language that essentially makes the process a little bit easier, but then it processes into the actual language, which is CSS, and that's what the browser reads. Okay, so hopefully that was a little bit confusing, I guess. But the only thing that you really need to know is that the link tag, the self-closing link tag, is just linking, literally, a style sheet called main.css. Okay. Now those, before we get too much deeper into linking files and attributes, rather, before we get more into attributes, I wanted to take a second and talk about the div and the span. Okay, these are just two more tags. They're very commonly used in HTML documents, and I want you to really, really get used to using these divs. Okay, divs are extremely important. It's a really good way to help you organize your document and maintain a certain level of control with your HTML documents. And what I mean by that is really the best way to break that down is to use our CSS. So that's what we're going to do. So here we see we have a header and a paragraph. Okay, they're right above each other. We can see those same header and paragraph here. Okay, so let's say we wanted this entire area to turn red. Well, we want the background to be red. Well, we could target our H1 and say background color red. And then we see our H1 turns red. And at the same time, we could always say paragraph and target our paragraph. Say background color red. But what just happened? First of all, we notice that there's gaps in between. So those are pretty ugly. Now it's looking like stripes instead of all this content being background red. Nextly, we have Our second paragraph, which I'll give a little space there so you can see better. Our second paragraph here has also turned red. Well, we really just wanted this paragraph to turn red. So there's a few ways to accomplish that, okay? One of those ways is, and actually let me back up a little bit. In order to understand what's happening here, number one, we have to understand the structure of our HTML document and its nesting. This is where nesting really comes into play. Okay, so here we have our body. We could technically say body H1, and it's going to accomplish the same thing. So we see nothing changed. Okay, we could also say body P. And all we're doing here, guys, is we're being more specific. So as opposed to saying just target the H1, we're saying target the H1 that is nested within the body. This has to do with specificity, okay? In order to understand specificity, you have to understand that, number one, we have our H1 nested within our body tag, okay? So it is a child of the body. If we were just to say, go back to our CSS here and say body background red, everything turns red, okay? Now, then we're being more specific and saying body, let's get rid of this, body H1 red. Or as we know already, we could just target the H1 and say H1 red. It's the same thing. But if we wanted to be more specific, we could say, we could give this an attribute, and the attribute would be called class, okay? So, and that goes within the tag, so within that open and close arrows, or greater than, less than. So that attribute, just like up here with our link, where we said link, then we gave it an attribute of relationship and an attribute href or reference. Now here we're giving the H1 an attribute called class. Now there's two main ways to target a specific tag. Let's say we had multiple H1s. Another header. Okay, so we can see that both of them are red because right here we said we targeted H1. So all H1 elements within that, all H1 elements within that body or within the HTML document, really, because we didn't specify and say body, are going to turn red. Okay, so what we're going to do here by giving it a class, we are basically giving it a variable name that we create ourselves. So that variable name could be anything. That class name can be just about anything. Here we're going to say main header. Okay, so nothing should change over here. We just gave it basically a name, a class name. So there's the class, and then there is the ID. So let's go ahead and give it an ID. We'll say head1. Okay, so we can, again, we can name the ID anything. The only difference here between the ID and the class attribute, guys, is that the ID is more specific. So regardless of whether we put, we attach that background to, let's say we said main header, oh, dot there, main header, and we said background color red. If we were to come down here below it and say ID head1 background color green, we would see it change green. And the reason for that is one of two reasons, guys. Now let's backtrack a little bit and understand what CSS really means. CSS stands for Cascade Style Sheet. I'm not sure if I said that a few times now, but Cascade essentially is just letting you know that it's reading the document from top to bottom. It's cascading. So in relationship to specificity or level of importance, the document or the CSS file is reading from top to bottom. So even though here our head, let's say we moved our main header underneath our that there, it still would be rendering green. And the reason is because an ID is always more specific. So according to this style sheet, it's going to say, okay, let me read from top to bottom. Okay, we have an ID with background color green. We have a class with the background color red. Well, I'm ignoring the class because the ID is more specific. So that is what you really need to know. Now, counterwise, if we got rid of that ID and just kept the class, we just kept our class main header, we would see that it's red. And if we go underneath and we say main header again, class, give it a class, main header, okay, and said background color green, we would see it turn green. Now, that is not due to specificity because here you can see we're being for lack of a better term or phrase, we're being the same amount of specific on both of these, but because it's referencing the document from top to bottom, it's going to render the second option, which essentially overwrites that. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. If not, leave me a message in the comments and I'll try and break it down a little further for you. But again, we're not explaining too much about this CSS, but what I really want you to focus on is the attribute. So once again, this is an attribute, class is an attribute, ID is an attribute, and they're acting essentially as ways of targeting this element, this entire element, more specifically. So, and specificity has more to do with CSS than HTML, but to give you a better understanding of what a class and ID is, we had to dive a little bit into that CSS. So don't get confused by that. We'll come back to that. And so a div is a way for you to control a section of code. Okay, so that section, let's go ahead and put a break there. In fact, we'll get rid of, actually, we'll leave that second paragraph. We'll just put a space there, actually. Space here. Okay, so we have a header, then we have a paragraph. Then we have another header, then we have another paragraph, okay? And they're only separated by their default margins. They all automatically have a margin associated with them, and that's what's causing the gap here, okay? So let's go ahead and throw a div in here. You can think of div as a divider. You can think of it as a box. You can think of it as a section. Really, I think it stands for divider. But essentially what's happening here is now we have wrapped our text in a div. And that basically means that everything inside of the div is a child to the div now. Okay, so we actually have control over everything within that div at once. So if we go back to our example with background color, we could give this an attribute equals section, let's say head section. So now we've given it an attribute of class. We've given it a class, and the class is head section. So if we were to come down here, let's go ahead and get rid of this. I don't want you to get confused. And we said dot head section. And again, this dot means it's a class. If it was a hashtag, or I forget what they call octahedron or something like that. If it was a hashtag, it would be an ID. So since it's a class, or wrong one. Since it's a class head section, we want to say dot head section, and then our open and close brackets. And then we're going to say background color red. And we'll see everything within that section has turned red. Okay? And that really is more of a specific, should give you more of an idea specifically of how nesting works, okay? Because if you remember correctly, if we were to say H1 background color green, we would see the H1's turned green, but that div section still stays red, okay? And so that has to do with the div and how the div works. Now, divs can be very useful in a number of ways, more specifically related to CSS, because, just to reiterate, they allow us to control everything within that section, that block, or that divider, or division, or section, whatever you want to call it. That box, I like to refer to them as div boxes, because that's really what they are. They are just containers. There we go. So a div is a container that gives us the ability to target all the information within that element at once that's nested within it. And hopefully that helps you guys to understand how a div works. If not, leave me a comment or leave me a message in the comments, and I'll try and break that down a little bit better for you. So, now that we've touched on what a div is, let's look at span. Span is interesting in that, like a div allows you to really access all the information that's nested within the div. Like that, similar to that, a span allows you to access all the text within the span. So let's take a look at an example of that here. So here we're going to say somewhere in the middle of our text, we're going to say span. Okay? And we're going to close it somewhere else. Okay? So nothing should change as far as our structure, nothing changed as far as our rendering here. In fact, let's get rid of, actually, let's leave that just for visual aid. And we'll actually say color white so you can see that a little better. Gives it font color. All right, so if we look here, we see that we just plugged in a span just somewhere inside of our text. And that, if you think about it like this, when you say to span something, it means you're just spanning the length of something or the width of something. So just to kind of give you an easier way to think about that, the span, like the div, see how the div is controlling all this content within it? Well, the span is doing the same thing. It allows us to access just that text within, let's say, a paragraph like this, or within a header like this. So essentially, in this example, the span is the child of the H1 element. In this example, the span is the child of the paragraph element, the P. And so what it's allowing us to do is inline target specifically this text. And so what's that going to accomplish for us? Well, more relative to the CSS, if we were to say span, we're just targeting the span element. So every span is going to be affected by this because we have to think about how specific are we being. So we're going to say span, open and close curly brackets. And then we're going to say font weight bold. Okay. So you know what? Actually, that might be a little difficult to see. Let's do font size 30 pixels. So we can see clearly that everything that we gave a span tag to has increased in font size to 30 pixels. That was probably already 30. Let's do 50. All right, so now we can see it affecting our tag here. Okay. So that if you ever have looked at a website where it was a paragraph, and more notably on newsletters and in dictionaries, kind of like Wikipedia, how certain fonts will be bolded, they're using spans. Okay, and that span is just allowing them to target that specific line of text within an element. Hopefully I didn't lose you there. So let's give you another example, and we'll say background. Okay. And so we can see again that only the background of those spans turned green. Now, what if we wanted to be more specific? Yeah, we could probably give this span a class name and say, we'll just say span text mid. We could be more specific, do that and say, come over here, change our span to dot text mid, and we would see that only this text is targeted. That has to do with our specificity. It also has to do with the fact that we're only targeting this one because it is the only element in the entire document that has a class of text mid. Or we could be specific and just say target. We could get rid of that class. Everything goes back. And then we could say target the span within the paragraph. So we would basically go here and we would say P. Oh, excuse me, I just sneezed, guys. I'm sorry. So we would say P, and then we would say span. And once again, we've been more specific without having to give it a specific ID or class name. Okay? All right, guys. So that is about the conclusion of this tutorial. We've covered some really interesting stuff about divs and spans, some more in-depth talk about nesting. If you liked the information in this tutorial and you found it useful, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps us to move the channel forward, and it allows me to dedicate more time into breaking down these concepts in a way that you guys can understand. So that's really the goal. On our next tutorial, we're going to get a little bit more in-depth and probably start moving closer to understanding some more basics about CSS, and get even more in-depth with our HTML. Our structure, we'll probably talk about the box model and some other things. So don't forget to hit the like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks for watching, and